Ottawa were indeed a national emergency, being an urgent, temporary, and critical situation that seriously endangers the health and safety of Canadians, or that threatens the ability of the government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada. I noted in particular that the barricades at the Ambassador Bridge and the blockades in Alberta and Manitoba were dismantled using the usual legal tools without the need to invoke Emergencies Act, that the disruptions did not result in any serious injury or significant property damage, that the many provinces have opposed themselves to invoking the Emergencies Act. Many experts and specialists have expressed doubts with regards to the need to invoke this act and about the inadequacy of the tools already available to law enforcement. Comparing the events in Ottawa and other emergencies also tend to speak to the urgent, serious, and critical nature of last week's disruptions. Let's consider, for example, the 2012 student strike in Quebec, which led to several months of demonstrations, often held at night, resulting in violent clashes between demonstrators and police, and they caused much property damage. The 1990 Oka crisis, which resulted in a 77-day blockade and the death of 2 people. In both of these cases, the Emergency Measures Act was not invoked. I also thought about some recent protests abroad, including the major disruption caused by the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, or by the Gilets jaunes in France, which lasted several months and led to injuries and resulted in much property damage. In none of these cases did governments invoke the equivalent of the Emergency Measures Act. I also noted that while the government's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act was defensible, the measures announced appeared quite broad in certain aspects and could set dangerous precedents. In particular, the prohibition of anyone simply participating in or traveling to a specific assembly, even if that person is not committing acts that are otherwise illegal. The broad authority to designate protected places, including some such as the Parliament Hill and other government buildings where citizens must be able to demonstrate peacefully. Also, broad prohibitions to contributions, financial or otherwise, that may be made to protesters by Canadian citizens.
Has also repeatedly mentioned the international dimension of the crisis. For the government, the disruptions in Ottawa and elsewhere damaged Canada's image as a stable and economically secure country. These are legitimate fears, but these are not the only ones that have been expressed abroad. The Economist magazine wrote last week that invoking the Emergencies Act was a terrible idea that could make Canada a more rancorous or bitterly divided country. For all these reasons, I was hesitant last week. There were arguments on both sides. I did not believe the government had made an unequivocal demonstration that Canada is going through a national crisis, that the tools ordinarily available to law enforcement were insufficient, and that we had reached the law of last resort. But I was also aware that my perception of the Emergency Measures Act is colored by my personal experience in the history of Quebec, and that in this case, this law was primarily aimed at a crisis in Ottawa. I thought that while the government didn't deserve a blank check, it could still get the benefit of the doubt, at least temporarily. But the reality is that the situation has changed considerably since last week. As the Globe and Mail wrote yesterday, the day before yesterday, the question before Parliament is not, was Canada facing an unprecedented national emergency a week ago? It is rather, is Canada facing an unprecedented national emergency today? Last week, there were arguments both for and against the Emergency Acts, but changed circumstances, the basic facts on the ground, have greatly strengthened the arguments against to the point where they are overwhelming.
The government itself repeats that it is assessing the situation every day and every hour. Our assessment of the motion must change as well based on the circumstances. Today, there is no longer a single blockade in Canada. There are a few trucks parked in Winnipeg. Ottawa has been cleared. More radical occupants have retreated. The extremist threat seems more diffused. There could still be doubts with regards to the utility of the Emergency Act to address the emergency last week. There's no doubt that a state of calm has now returned. We're no longer in a crisis. In response to questions, the government argues it must maintain the Emergency Measures Act as a preventive measure to manage a risk of further demonstrations. I don't think a government can invoke the Emergencies Act as a preventative measure. It's not a risk management tool. In all societies, including in Canada, there will always be risks. In my view, the government cannot justify the application of the Emergencies Act by referring to an undefined risk, a hypothetical threat, or potential disruption. In light of the overall situation across the country, the government's assertion that has secret information about potential threats is not sufficient to justify continuing emergency measures. This opens the door to obvious abuses. This law is highly valued by police services. I salute their efficiency, professionalism, and restraint. This law can be useful and effective, but the question before us today is whether it is still absolutely necessary. The government also mentions that the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act was well received by Canadians. I have no doubt about that. But that's not the question. The Senate has the privilege and the responsibility to consider and vote unfettered by electoral considerations. I also note that if the Senate were to vote against the government's motion this week, it would not have the effect of retroactively invalidating the decisions that have been taken or the actions that have been taken since the proclamation of the legislation. This effect seems to me to be consistent with the legitimate idea of giving the government the benefit of the doubt in terms of the situation over the past week. But I have not received a satisfactory answer to the key question that arises today. What is the threshold? What are the criteria that the government will use to decide whether to revoke the law? The true challenge we have here today is to maintain social cohesion in a society that is increasingly polarized. My colleagues, Kim Pate and Paula Simons, talked about it fantastically yesterday. In preparing a UNESCO conference in Quebec on the radicalization of young people that leads to violence, Quebec and Canada are not spared. Social media are amplifying all of this anger, and public health measures have become a rallying cry. It's very concerning. What is comforting in the short term is the context in the field has changed. Today, there's no ambiguity that could incite us to support the Emergencies Act. However, I will listen to my colleagues' arguments with care until the vote on Motion 17. Thank you.
Resuming debate, Senator Ousakos, followed by Senator Deakin, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honorable colleagues, in my 13 years in the Senate of Canada, I don't think I have risen on a more important debate and issue than this one. I want to remind all senators in this chamber that our fundamental role when we were summoned to this place is to be the voice of our regions, to be the voice of minorities in this country. Voices that need to be heard, voices that need to be represented when they feel they're not being adequately represented, particularly in the other side, but also when they feel that they're being trampled on by the executive branch of government. There's no role more important in this place than the role of oversight of this institution on the government. And in this particular instance, we see a government where 1 minute these protesters, convoys were coming to Ottawa and they were marginalized by the Prime Minister. He called them a fringe minority. And the next minute, this fringe minority, the small group of Canadians that are anti-vaxxers and anti-mandates, all of a sudden became such a threat that we had to impose something that's been done in this country only 3 times before in the history of this country. So clearly, from that admission, Prime Minister was wrong when he called this group a fringe group, a minority. Colleagues, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that it wasn't a fringe group. It isn't a fringe group. This country is deeply divided like I've never seen in my 50+ years. A proud Canadian. I've seen governments come and go. We've seen many crises in public discourse in the country, but never in my lifetime have I seen the deep divisions. And it's moments like this when the executive branch of government has an obligation, and every prime minister has an obligation to put the nation's interest above the interests of himself, his party, and partisan politics. I saw that many times under the leadership of Stephen Harper. I saw it firsthand in his caucus. I saw it under the leadership of former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, who I always appreciated. He put the nation first, regardless of political differences at various times. And God knows he had some very tough crossroads to manage in this country. I saw that under the leadership of Brian Mulroney as well. I know there's always a temptation on the part of politicians to wedge, to divide for political benefit, and I've seen firsthand that it works. But in these moments of an existential crisis, all prime ministers are obligated to bring the parties together, not to throw fuel on the fire, not to call protesters names, not to call them extreme right or extremists or racists, or a few other words I won't even mention. We've had this debate and there's no point to revisit it. That kind of political posturing is completely unnecessary. And we saw this government do it in the last general election, where they tried to create the atmosphere of them versus us. Somebody did some polls. So they realized, wow, 80% of Canadians are double vaxxed. So we'll make an example of the 20% of Canadians that don't want to be vaxxed, or are vax hesitant, or have medical conditions, or have a phobia, or whatever the reasons may be. I believe in freedom, yes. I believe in freedom of a man and a woman to choose if they take a medical procedure. It's their choice in this country. Before you go for a surgery, they ask you to sign a form, a waiver. I don't think it's much to ask in this country as a Canadian citizen to have your governments lay off when it comes to taking vaccines or medications or medical procedures, or being forced to have or not have an abortion. It's the same type of debate for me as a libertarian. These are rights that should be fundamental in the country. So when these protesters come to Ottawa, there should be consistent rules for all Canadians. I'm double vaxxed. I try to persuade my friends, my neighbors, everybody. I believe it's genuinely the way to go in order to mitigate this disease and fight it to the best of our ability. But I also recognize the right of somebody else not to be vaxxed. I recognize the right of somebody to expect their government to be fair with all citizens, to be just with all citizens. So when protesters come to Ottawa, or they go to Coutts, or they go to Quebec City, or they go to Toronto, they have the right of protest. It's fundamental in our democracy, and nobody can take that away. But you know what? When protesters went to the G20 a few years back, they had the legitimate right to protest. When Indigenous communities had legitimate issues with the government, they went to the extreme with armed protests, shutting down infrastructure and railway crossings in this country for a number of weeks. When Black Lives Matter protests for issues that are important, they're fundamentally on the right side of where they should be on it. And every politician has the right to respect these protests. We have an obligation, particularly as parliamentarians, as a prime minister, whoever it is, to dialogue with these people. Somebody said earlier in their speech that the 3 R's are the most important thing in our democracy: rights, responsibilities, and respect. I think it was Senator Arnott, and I agree with him. It's a right to protest in this country. It's a responsibility, though, of Parliament and our Prime Minister and our governments to dialogue with these citizens. These are not enemies of the state. These are frustrated Canadians. If it's Black Lives Matter, if it's the Indigenous communities, if it's people at a G20 for economic reasons. We saw what happened in my province of Oka many years ago. I'm old enough to remember. And in all those instances, prime ministers threw water on the fire. They dialogued. They sent ministers in for discussions. They sent bureaucrats in to have chats with these people, trying to figure out what the problem was. They didn't say, you're undesirables, you're racists, you march with swastikas, you're tearing down monuments when they didn't tear down monuments. We've had other protests in this country which desecrated monuments across the country, which burned down religious centers of worship. The Prime Minister didn't run out to invoke the Emergencies Act. He dialogued. So why in this instance did he choose to do otherwise? Is it because maybe he thought the poll numbers were on his side? Maybe he thought he'd get away once again of trying to create the us majority versus them, the minority? And then all of a sudden he started realizing even us double-vaxxed people are frustrated in this country. We're frustrated with mandates that are not fair. For example, when a government institutes a travel mandate, they should institute a travel mandate. But no, there's a double standard with the policies of this government. So if you're a wealthy Canadian and you need to go see a family member in New Jersey or California, not a problem. Hop on a plane, you do your PCR test, you come back, you quarantine, life's a dream. If you have a sick mother in Vermont, for example, and you're in Montreal and you need to go visit your sick mom, you can't get over the border because of COVID, because of mandates. We got to do this. We got to save the country. But of course, if you sit back and think about it, so the sacrifices are going to be done for those who can't afford to get on a plane and drive over a border, and those who can fly, well, you're good. More double standards. We have a case in point where we had protests at Coots. We had protests at the Ambassador Bridge. Governments, police authorities there were able to bring down the temperature. They were able to resolve that issue. Nobody called the Prime Minister and said, give us the Emergencies Act or else we can't get it done. Sûreté du Québec and the police authorities in Quebec City, they planned for the protests effectively. They calmed things down. They dealt with it appropriately. There was no need for emergency measures. So this is the kind of irresponsible behavior on the part of the government that just can't be excused. It just cannot be. This Prime Minister has tripled down for political expediency and nothing else when he saw that he was losing. And to this day, he hasn't once taken any responsibility for this issue. The other element, colleagues, is this thing could have been resolved very quickly if this government would have done or is willing to do what governments across this country have been doing now for over a week, announcing that they are removing mandates. It was the easiest thing. Alberta did it, Saskatchewan did it, Ontario did it, the Quebec government did it. The only one who has tripled down and is refusing to eliminate those mandates is Prime Minister Trudeau. And at this point, we see there's no good reason for it, except he doesn't want to acknowledge political defeat. This isn't a game. This is about bringing the country that's deeply divided together. This is about reconciliation after coming out of a terrible, terrible crisis called COVID. And by the way, colleagues, make no mistake about it, this is just the beginning of disruption because the next crisis around the corner is fundamentally worse. And this Prime Minister has buried his head in the sand regarding that one as well. And I'll get to that towards the end. But he's invoked an emergency measure, which again was unnecessary, given the police and police authorities in this country overkill, overarching authority essentially to do essentially what they want without any accountability to anybody. And the government leader yesterday pretty much said to us that trust me, trust the government. There's enough evidence to justify this. I haven't seen it. He acknowledged that he hasn't seen it. I think Senator Tanis asked him about it. We haven't seen it, but the Parliament of Canada, trust me, we can freeze accounts. We can give the police all this authority to take care of what it seems to me they should be able to take care of with our present laws. And if the present laws on the books aren't sufficient to manage a few protesters in Ottawa and on Parliament Hill, we're lawmakers. Let's change the laws. Let's not tell the government, take over, be a dictatorship. Come to Parliament and say, this is what we need, and we need it quickly. As you've seen, Senator Gold, we are very agile in this place over the last 2 years. Everything you've asked of your colleagues in the Senate, we've done relatively quickly. You need billions of dollars, we approved them. We need changes in order to deal with COVID. We've dealt with them even when we had reservations. We haven't pushed back. There hasn't been any hesitation. But telling police officers, go ahead and you decide who enters your parliamentary precinct, you make a list of who's appropriate to enter and who's not, I find that unbelievable. And yes, local residents were inconvenienced in a big way. Unfortunately, the frustration of Canadians has reached such a boiling point where, yes, they're causing chaos in the streets. That should be a red alert that we should sit down and find out how we can address them. That's our job. Foreign investment in this country in the last few days since the Emergency Measures Act has basically come to a standstill. We've seen it. You've seen the stats now. And it's even worse than it was before the Emergency Measures Act, which was pretty pitiful. Foreign investment in this country is at the lowest level it's been in 7 years, 8 years. So when we become the laughingstock of other Western democracies, when we're all over the front page news in the UK, in the United States, in France, in Germany, where I'm getting calls from parliamentarians and friends saying, "What's happening to your great democracy?" And I have no answer. I can't explain it. I can't explain that a few 100,000 people in Ottawa overcame the laws of this country, our police forces and our public security system, that we had to invoke a measure that was invoked only 3 other times in the history of this country: World War I, World War II, and of course, the October crisis. And colleagues, in each and every one of those cases where that act was invoked, history has proved there was indiscretions. History has proved that we made mistakes. We wronged people in a serious way, where governments later on had to stand up in this place and the other and apologize for those indiscretions. So it's not good enough, colleagues, to say, trust the government. It's not the role of the Senate or the House of Commons to trust the government. That's for the people to decide during elections if they want to trust them or don't trust them. This place, our job is to question them, is to see the facts before we're forced to vote on certain things. Now, we also have a prime minister, in addition to calling people names, he has another talent. He likes to reinvent things. Like all of a sudden, the government leader in the Senate has become the representative. Partisanship has become an evil thing in public debate. Independent parliamentarian is a parliamentarian that rubber stamps their political program and their government agenda. Extremists, racists, extreme right wing. These are all code words for anybody who opposes us. We're going to tag you. We're going to put an etiquette on you. That's, like I said, politically very astute. It's worked very well so far. I think slowly catching up to him. And colleagues, Prime Minister Trudeau said at the beginning of this crisis, we're all in this together. That's what he said. He said, we're going to be in this together. Unless, we have your back. But unless you're a trucker. If you're a trucker, you're on your own. Unless you're not willing to accept a medical procedure. If you're unwilling to take a vaccine, you're on your own in a big way. Unless you can't afford to fly on an airplane, you're going to be locked in your house and quarantined by this government, because somehow there's different rules for those that can get on a plane and different rules for those that are going by with 4 wheels because they can't afford to do otherwise. I'm seeing, colleagues, unfortunately, this dangerous thing developing in our country, and it's called the bureaucratic oligarchy, where people like us, we have the privilege of a paycheck every couple of weeks, guaranteed. We have, as do all those who work for government agencies across this country. So during this COVID crisis, we saw, the government had the back of all those people. Our employees were working from home. We found ways to accommodate them. Our employees, we made sure that their paychecks were on time. So there wasn't as big a hit as those other citizens who are not part of the bureaucratic oligarchy like I am. I have that privilege. Other citizens who actually have to work in the private sector, who have been hit with a 30% pay cut, who unfortunately have lost their jobs and they're starting to feel the pain. So colleagues, all I have to say in conclusion is the following: that we have an obligation to make sure that this divided country has some reconciliation, comes together, and recognize that we have to represent the interest of all Canadians in dealing with this crisis. Because now we're getting through the crisis of COVID, but the next one, and you all see it, go to your grocery store, and it's $200 to buy a roast to feed a family of 3 or 4. Again, the bureaucratic oligarchs, us privileged, we can afford it.
Housakis, but your time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Deakin, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you, honorable colleagues, for this incredibly important and robust debate. I'm speaking to you today from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. Colleagues, I deeply value free speech. I deeply value peaceful protest, but these have not been peaceful protests about free speech. For example, those who came to occupy Ottawa were demanding that the federal government remove all mandates related to COVID-19, regardless of whether those mandates were issued by the American government, the Canadian government, or one of our 13 provincial or territorial governments. Then we learned that the protest organizers had the stated objective of overthrowing a recently elected government and parliament. Yet these protesters were still given the chance to voice their views peacefully on the weekend of January 29th. The voices of these protesters were definitely heard, loudly, not peacefully, but loudly. When their unreasonable and unconstitutional demands were not met, they entrenched. Day and night, the occupiers made their presence known. Where people lived, where they worked, and on the streets. Businesses were shuttered, costing an estimated $15 million in lost wages and sales every day. Lawlessness and disorder prevailed, and the citizens of businesses of Ottawa were far from alone. Countless Canadians have been harmed by the blockades of critical infrastructure across our country. These blockades disrupted billions of dollars of international and local trade. They caused struggling private businesses to close and send workers home. They damaged our most critical trading relationship at a crucial time, and they stained our global reputation. This level of instability in one of the world's most treasured democracies should be deeply concerning to all of us. Colleagues, the occupation of a G7 capital by individuals who made it clear that they are not going to respect the rule of law or leave voluntarily was untenable. Regardless of all the ineffective actions and jurisdictional failings that led up to this crisis, the Ottawa Police and the Ontario Provincial Police were clearly incapable of restoring the rule of law. As a consequence, I firmly believe that the invocation of the Emergencies Act on February 14th was both necessary and justified. Personally, I draw comfort from the checks and balances within the Act and the fact that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms remains preeminent. But we will have to listen carefully to the concerns of certain groups, especially vulnerable and minority groups who justifiably worry about precedents being set here. Canadians with a history of being marginalized, racialized, and dominated by the majority are rightfully afraid that this use of the Act could set a worrisome standard for future processes. Their fears are likely fueled by their firsthand knowledge of past police actions taken without the use of the Emergencies Act in situations that look nothing like recent events. Now I'd like to focus on the use of checks and balances within the Emergencies Act. An inquiry will be triggered when the Act is revoked, be it through the will of Parliament with the House or Senate exercising their rights under Section 59, or by a decision of this government. Canadians should rightly expect that inquiry to be thorough, balanced, and nonpartisan in its examination of, and I quote, the circumstances that led to the declaration being used and the measures taken for dealing with the emergency, end quote. Over the next year, the inquiry will call upon the Prime Minister and his cabinet to defend their use of the Act, and the people of Canada will ultimately have the opportunity to decide whether they agree with the actions taken. The inquiry will need to clear up some troubling questions leading up to the invocation of the Act, how special powers were used and why those special powers were needed in the first place. And leading up to its invocation, my questions include, in what ways did partisan language, tactics, and actions escalate tensions and anger among protesters and broaden involvement? During the first week of this crisis, Conservative MP Michael Chong and Liberal MP Joelle Lightbound both spoke powerfully about the worrisome national divisions caused and widened by partisanship as it is now practiced in Canada. For far too many, simply being anti-conservative or anti-liberal justifies saying and doing things that can only divide Canadians, not unite them. Was the required security and intelligence available to each level of government and police force leading up to and during each protest? If not, why not? What barriers did jurisdictional issues present, and how did they prevent decisive action? Why were the police limited in their ability to secure essential services? These are all, in my mind, very important questions leading up to the invocation of the Act. In terms of the powers used under the Act, I think we need to carefully examine issues that include the following. What burden of proof existed prior to freezing the roughly 200 personal and corporate bank accounts and 250 crypto addresses? How many accounts were frozen in air? What process was used to release the affected individual and corporate accounts so that these individuals do not remain unbanked and uninsured? The actions taken could cause significant financial harm, potentially to people who have not broken the law, but also to those people that we don't want to become less connected to broader society. I trust that this inquiry will examine how quickly and completely each one of these situations was resolved. Lastly, I want us to examine why we got to the point where the Emergencies Act was required to access crucial financial measures. Specifically, I hope the inquiry will examine issues that include, first, why is our financial oversight system not capable of monitoring the financial activities used during these occupations without invoking the Emergencies Act? The organizers showed sufficient raising and distributing a large number of donations, including those made using crypto assets. But these activities used are not very new, and their use was far from unimaginable. Yet these activities remain unregulated. Our regulations and corresponding due process have got to start to keep up with market realities. This crisis has caused new payment financial entities, but the fact that it took a crisis for this to happen is troubling. Second, why have we failed to revamp our approach to anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing, despite FinTrack's existing protocols capturing less than 1% of estimated criminal money flows in Canada? How has this not been a priority? The status quo means that bad actors are 99% successful in moving their money in Canada. Our current system is a burden for good actors and fails to track bad actors unless we use the Emergencies Act. This is an unacceptable reality. Third, how are we incapable of identifying and regulating foreign funding coming into Canada for political, ideological, or illegal purposes? Why have new regulations and appropriate processes not been prioritized in the digital era? Simply, our financial regulators have technological and market realities. Canada has stagnated as disruption has accelerated. Highly disruptive point-of-sale technologies using crypto payments now exist, yet we still are not thoughtfully building a financial system that will keep up with market realities. We have got to start to prioritize data rights, financial inclusiveness, and global competitiveness while protecting the freedom in financial decision-making and dramatically limiting the role of bad actors. This is no small task. With each of these issues, I worry about how much legislative work is needed, but in an environment where Canadians' trust in their public and political institutions has been weakened, and their faith in what they see on social media only seems to grow. This is deeply worrisome. Rebuilding lost trust must be a top priority. It might be helped by prioritizing the use of consultative ways to engage Canadians in building shared solutions to shared problems, and eliminate the paternalistic Ottawa knows best approach where Canadians are given a predetermined solution to a pre-selected problem. Colleagues, throughout our country, Canadians have continued to do their jobs, but they are stressed, tired, and worn out. But they continued to work. I'm grateful for the million-plus Canadians who have struggled, tired, and without reprieve to keep our healthcare system from collapsing through this crisis. I'm grateful for the 130,000 truckers who have continued to provide deliveries across our country day in and day out. I'm grateful for the countless essential workers who remain heroes despite no longer receiving their hero pay. I'm grateful to the journalists who protect our democracy by constantly searching for the light of truth, and I'm grateful for the police, first responders, business owners, and ordinary citizens who keep our communities functioning. I'm grateful that all of these Canadians have continued to do their jobs. Colleagues, I believe now is the time for the Canadian politicians to lower the temperature, drop the partisan rhetoric, and focus on building a more sustainable, inclusive, and prosperous path forward for all Canadians. That's our job. I worry if we don't do it. Thank you, colleagues.
Senatrice Belmar, en débat.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank all senators who took the floor throughout these discussions that were well thought out and well felt. I also want to thank Senator Gold, who answered our questions in a very remarkable way. Let me express my concerns about the emotion I'm shared between the arguments for and against, and I share the concerns that were expressed by Senators Patterson, Senator Meville Deschênes, and all those who, like me, are confused. But let me say something for Quebecers listening to us and who have been who suffered the Wars Act in 1970. The Emergencies Act cannot be compared to the war measures. It's a lot lighter than the 1970 Act. The Charter of Rights did not exist at the time, and civil liberties were violated in Quebec. Such political attacks will no longer be possible with the Emergencies Act, particularly because of parliamentary and judicial controls that are incorporated in the law. I would also like to underscore that in this concern, I'm totally convinced that the forces of law had to intervene to stop the occupation of the Ottawa downtown, as they had to do to ensure safety on the Ambassador Bridge. The demonstrators interfered with the liberties of people and had significant economic consequences. But the successful interventions in Windsor raised some questions. If the law was not necessary in that case, why will it be necessary in the downtown Ottawa context? We did not clearly receive those answers. The Emergency Measures Act was introduced on February 14th, and downtown Ottawa was cleared of occupants last weekend. I understand that the people of Ottawa, and in particular, all the individuals and families who live in downtown Ottawa, have suffered from this occupation. I sympathize with them. A majority of Canadians agree with the use of the Emergency Measures Act. Some of the scenes during the occupation of downtown Ottawa, such as the installation of temporary hot tubs and supply buildings, which were incredible in themselves, outraged many Canadians who realized that many of the protesters were there to stay for a long time. It was high time to act. Today, in principle, the occupation is over. We no longer need this law, which contains a set of measures which are rather difficult, particularly the financial measures, freezing of bank accounts. Even though the law specifies in its preamble that the measures are subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, some measures raise some questions. In particular, the economic measures included in the proclamation allow financial institutions to freeze the bank funds of persons considered to have violated the law. Is it certain that they will withstand legal challenges? The future will tell us. Where does my hesitation come from with respect to the motion before us? We are responding to events born of the frustrations created by the suspension of many freedoms over the past 2 years, by a law that suspends even more freedoms, because even though many of the organizers of the occupation seem to belong to extreme right-wing groups, they have received the sympathy of many Canadians, frustrated by the confinement measures and the division created in families and communities. I cannot ignore the context in which the use of the measures was made, which was the loss of freedoms during the pandemic. For 2 years, the containment measures adopted in the context of the pandemic have had real effects on the state of democracy in the world. In this regard, let me highlight the words of the Democracy Index 2020, published by the British magazine The Economist. And let me quote some paragraphs.
Of civil liberties, attacks on freedom of expression, and the failure of democratic accountability that occurred as a result of the pandemic in 2020 are grave matters. This is why the scores for many questions in the civil liberties category and the functioning of the government category of the Democracy Index were downgraded across multiple countries in 2020. Regardless of whether there was public support for the government measures, countries that withdrew civil liberties or failed to allow proper scrutiny of new emergency powers were penalized. Fin de la citation.
End of quote. All countries have adopted similar measures to combat the pandemic. Measures borrowed from the Chinese model, which was the first country affected. In short, the document produced by The Economist states that the methods in authoritarian and democratic countries have been the same, considering that China was the first affected country, and also considering that there were no other examples. With the exception of a few countries like Sweden, before the advent of vaccines, there was nothing else that democratic countries could do, maybe. In Quebec, the use of the curfew, an extreme measure, was used on several occasions. Only recently, in January 2022, it wasn't well received by some people, and I think it was the last drop that created lots of frustrations amongst the adult population, amongst people, particularly amongst the young. And I can talk a lot about this. But let's come back to the Democracy Index for Canada in particular, and I quote The Economist once again.
To score highly in 2020 Democracy Index, thanks to the country's
young. And I can talk a lot about this. But let's come back to the Democracy Index for Canada in particular, and I quote The Economist once again.
To score highly in 2020 Democracy Index, thanks to the country's history of stable democratic government. Canada's political participation score rose to its highest level ever in 2020, propelling Canada into the top 5 countries in the global ranking for the first time. Alors, c'est un accomplissement.
That was an achievement. However, even though Canada is amongst the most democratic countries in the world, there's a point on which it lost points. And let me quote again.
Restrictions led to a deterioration in the functioning of government score in Canada. Alors, les restrictions, effectivement, nous ont empêché.
The restrictions prevented us from playing our role as we should have, as we normally did. The pandemic had a real impact on democracy in the world and in Canada as well. We must be aware of that and most often take action to protect our democracy. Let me add that countries that had the highest scores were the Scandinavian countries. That being said, these are my questions. Are we going to renew emergency measures that are still liberticidal in a context where individual freedoms have already been attacked greatly in Canada during the pandemic? Even though we want to go back to a normal life, without knowing if the act is necessary. As Senator Delphine said, this may set a dangerous precedent that sets a low bar for invoking emergency legislation some other time. Are we impoverishing the expression of our democratic reflexes? The Senate is a place of second thought. We are not here to govern in the place of the government. But it is difficult to endorse a step in the void. It is temporary, however. It's 30 days. But as Senator Cotter explained, this measure is desired by a majority of Canadians. It will not apply in my province unless the Premier of Quebec decides otherwise. It has been adopted by a majority of MPs in the House of Commons. Not to ratify this measure in the Senate, which is endorsed by most people, will surely create significant political tension. Finally, as Senator Cotter said, I am not sure that we have the legitimacy to not give the government the benefit of doubt at this time. Particularly, as I said a while ago, this act would soon end. We can track this file and ensure that a full investigation is done 60 days after the end of the emergency measures and that a parliamentary committee is quickly put in place. These provisions do not exist in the previous act. In conclusion, I hope sincerely that Canada will take its cue from the countries that have had one of the highest indices of democracy, namely the Scandinavian countries. Having studied many of their public policies, part of their recipe is a spirit of consultation and social dialogue that animates these societies. Our confederation needs institutions that allow for better consultation between governments and social dialogue with civil society. The obligation to resort to emergency measures might not have been necessary with more consultation between the various levels of government. The adoption of the emergency measures speaks volumes about the poverty of our institutions of consultation and social dialogue in Canada. And in times of polarization of ideas, we need institutions of consultation and social dialogue to combat the polarization that accompanies misinformation. As you know, consultation, dialogue enable us to share the same information and to strengthen our common values. For now, dear colleagues, considering all that, I believe that I'll give the government the benefit of doubt. For now, thank you.
On debate, Senator Tanis.
Thank you, Speaker. I'd like to start by thanking all senators for your interventions. It's in moments like these, situations like these that occur rarely in our chamber, but with some regularity, I guess, over my 9 years. I'm reminded of the incredible talent and wisdom that we have in this chamber. I say often to people that Canadians should read the biographies and tune in once in a while to the Senate. Truly, this has been a tremendous debate. I have to say I'm envious of the certainty with which people have put forward their positions. With disciplined arguments advanced by both sides. In fact, there was an excellent juxtaposition of that with Senator Arnott and Senator Marshall, who had opposite plans and both made what I found to be powerful presentations for their position. I find myself out of my element. Doesn't happen very often to me. I find myself almost detached in a surreal situation, like an observer. I've always been able to draw on my personal and professional experience, but it's always been anchored and confirmed by the values of my family and my community. This isn't available to me today. My community, my country is divided, severely divided. We can't have a discussion about anything anymore because we can't even agree on the facts. This is a very, very distressing time in Canada. I'm not seeing leadership. I'm not seeing leadership to bring us together. I'm not seeing leadership from any quarter, whether it is the Prime Minister's office or the Leader of the Opposition's office, premiers. It's no wonder that we continue down this path. I'd like to thank the Truckers of Canada. According to the Canadian Trucking Association, there are 320,000 Canadians working in the trucking industry. It's about 2% of the entire workforce in Canada. Day in and day out, they deliver food and goods of all sorts to and from Canada, to and from neighborhoods, to and from homes. During COVID, we actually relied more on their work. We asked them to do more than they usually do. We all bought stuff and had it delivered to our homes that we would normally have gone somewhere and purchased. For much of the time, they did it with no vaccines. Nobody had a vaccine available to them. They did it anyway. Their work is difficult, and in many cases, it's solitary. They're by themselves. It's often dangerous. Road conditions, traffic conditions. I want to say to the Truckers of Canada, you are appreciated, you're valued, and you're respected. Your collective reputation has been appropriated by many people and many organizations for their own purposes in this unsettled time. But reasonable people recognize that. I want to thank peace officers who showed remarkable skill and restraint and determination over the past few weeks as they restored necessarily the public order in Coots, at the Ambassador Bridge, other places, but especially here in Ottawa. 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity on a couple of occasions to walk through the Ottawa convoy protest site on Wellington Street. Anyone who visited that site could not help but notice that this particular protest was populated by people from across the country, coast to coast to coast, as people like to say. They were represented by many cultures and creeds and political perspectives, some of them wacky, but the vast majority of them represented by millions of Canadians. You know, I have to say that I followed some of the media coverage as the convoy started out west and rolled towards Ottawa. I didn't follow it closely. The media presented it as a ragtag group of Westerners that were coming to Ottawa. We've heard it in discussions similar to the Yellow Vest and the energy support group that came from the West, and they were on their way to Ottawa. And so I was very surprised when I arrived up on the hill to find that the vast majority of trucks that were parked there were from Quebec and Ontario. I couldn't find an Alberta truck actually on Wellington Street. I have not heard one word from anyone in the media about the fact that that protest was national in nature. I have never heard anybody say, how did these crazy Albertans that have been arrested manage to communicate with all these people in Quebec, if this is a conspiracy, to come to Ottawa on this day? It strains credibility to believe that those folks, because I don't believe any of them speak French or have a network in Quebec, were able to convince that many truckers from that province, and I'm using it as an example, to come to Ottawa. The fact is, it was a groundswell of support from across this country. It's that simple. Millions of Canadians identified with the protest. Millions of Canadians still feel the way that they did when they identified with that protest. Thousands upon thousands of Canadians gave $10 and $5 and $20 to that crowdfunding site because it made them feel good that they had a hand in supporting what was going to be a protest in Ottawa against continued government intrusion in their lives after the last 2 years. I don't believe that it is any more complicated than that, but we'll see. You know, the sad irony of what happened on February the 15th when the Emergencies Act was invoked is that people who were here to protest intrusion by the government in their lives, the answer to the problem was more intrusion in their lives through the Emergencies Act. It's brought the temperature up. But I agree with Senator St. Germain. I agree with Senator Marshall and others. It should never, ever have come to what it did come to. A 3-week illegal occupation should never have been allowed to occur. There's lots of blame to go around, and the inquiry that will follow, I hope, is unflinching in assigning that blame where it belongs, finding out the facts and assigning responsibility. And I hope that the people and the organizations that are found to have been wanting take responsibility for it. Nonetheless, colleagues, I believe that the government made a decision to invoke the Act based on facts in their possession in a very volatile situation. And in that moment, they did their job. They made a decision, and I believe they made it responsibly. That decision was made 9 days ago. Since then, the Coutts protest, the Ambassador Bridge protest, the Ottawa blockades and occupations have been stopped. The streets have been cleared. Traffic is going on Wellington Street and on the other streets as it was before. There's been a cleanup and there's been preventative measures that need to be instituted, and I have every faith that the police and the relevant authorities will make those measures preventative measures. Senator Gold made a defense of why we need to continue the Emergencies Act today, why it needs to continue. But I don't believe that we are anywhere near any kind of definition of a national security emergency here today on February the 23rd. Canadians are divided about the use of the Emergencies Act. There's no question about that. A few days ago, in fact, after the invocation, there was a poll conducted by Main Street Research, which highlight this fact. 39% of Canadians strongly oppose the Emergencies Act and its use now. It's repugnant to many of those people. 38% strongly agree with the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And the rest of the folks either somewhat oppose or somewhat support or don't have an opinion. So 39 to 38 means we're divided. The majority is divided. So I think we need, at this moment in time, to consider this motion not for its utility in approving a decision that happened 9 days ago. I think we need to consider whether or not this divisive action is still needed today. So, with all of that, on these insufficient words, I will leave it there. I will vote no to the continuation of the Emergencies Act on the basis that I believe it is no longer needed and it is doing nothing but dividing Canadians, and will do so in increasing numbers every day, every hour that it is in force. Thank you.
Question? Senator Coyle?
Would Senator Tanis take a question?
Yes.
Thank you, Senator Tanis, and thank you so much for your thoughtful remarks. I always, I think like everyone here, pay attention when you get up because we know you have considered the matter at hand with great seriousness. So I thank you for your speech today. And you know, it's something, as you have said, all of us are grappling with a very serious matter that is before us. This is a serious matter. The divisions that you have mentioned and others have mentioned as central to what caused the situation we are now in are matters of great, great concern. I have a concern related to, and coming to the question, to the poll that you just cited, showing almost even numbers of Canadians who are supportive of the emergencies measures, the Emergencies Act, and those who are against it. What I worry about is, probably on both sides, do they know what it is? And I'm particularly actually worried about those who are against it, because I do believe and know for a fact, because of what's been coming at me in all those emails, or in many, many, many of the emails we've been receiving, is that many people in Canada have been fed, unfortunately, a message that this is, in fact, the War Measures Act, the draconian War Measures Act that was invoked twice in Canada's history, not 3 times, twice in Canada's history. This is a new act, a very different act, and I know there's a nuance there that is very hard for Canadians to understand, and therefore leaves people susceptible to deception. Could you speak to that?
Senator Tanis?
Yes, I can. I think it's never been used, this particular act, since its creation in 1988. That speaks for itself. We've gone all these years, more than 30 years, without it needing to be used. We've been through some difficult times in our country. 9/11 is one that jumps to mind and has been mentioned here. It's never been used. I think Canadians know that it is not a piece of legislation that is meant to be used lightly, and that it does impinge on freedoms. And I think they know it on both sides. I agree with you. I think the nomenclature can be torqued depending on which, what argument you want to make. So I don't think it's, I think it highlights the issue and probably highlights the division. There are people who believe that rare exceptions like this should never be used and should never be normalized. And there are others who who have believe that, what happened in Ottawa was, made it necessary. I don't know. To me, it is an example of the alternate facts that's working. I'll give you another example that to me, I think has bothers me. It bothers me when I looked up and down Wellington Street at the protest that was there. I've said it needed to be broken up, but that was not a group of white supremacists and racists. It had some in it. There's always going to be some wackos that attach to every protest. And there's been, we don't even need to get into that. But that was the narrative of our government, of our leader. I was enormously uncomfortable with that, disappointed with that, just as I was disappointed with others who went and stood with people, not with ideas, but with the people that were doing something illegal in the streets of Ottawa. I don't know if I answered your question, but that was my best shot.
Senator Cotter, question?
Would Senator Tanis take one more question?
Sure.
This is a difficult question for me to ask, Senator Tanis, and I generally don't do this. I did appreciate the heartfelt nature of your remarks, and I'm in many respects entirely sympathetic with them. My question, I guess, is that if we all were to agree with you, we would all vote no to this motion. But the problem with voting no, it seems to me, is it's impossible to distinguish whether we are sending a message that the emergency should have never been declared or it was legitimate to declare but should be canceled out now. And I'm sympathetic to that tension. So I want to ask you this question. The legislation contemplates a power in us, with 20 senators to sign it, to initiate a process to bring this to an end. So I guess I'm inviting the question of whether to meet the description and the goal that you have in mind, we ought to endorse the emergency resolution and declaration and then move for its revocation. By that, we would state the legitimacy of the resolution, but the need for it to now be canceled. And I guess I'm interested in knowing whether that's a better course in our consideration of the very points that you made. Thanks.
Senator Tanis.
Thank you. And I actually really wanted to, I wrestled with that myself. But here's the conclusion I came to. Nobody's asking our permission to invoke. It's already been invoked. It's in play for 9 days. If we don't make a decision on this, it will continue to be in play for the next 20 odd days till it expires. So I don't feel somehow obligated to make the two-step process, given the fact that I wasn't asked. We weren't asked for permission. And the Act's fairly clear that if we reject, it's canceled, but all the other things carry on, the inquiry, et cetera. So it probably had some intention. I don't know, I haven't read Hansard, but it probably, there was an intention to have this process such that it could be stopped after having been invoked and used, and that parliamentarians, in their wisdom, would recognize that it was no longer needed. You know, so that's, I would not suggest to anybody here that you need to be troubled about granting your permission for what nobody asked for permission on 9 days ago. As the reason not, if you feel strongly about having it stopped today, because the 10 senator program will take many, many days. Frankly, I predict that if we start the process, and I will be like Senator McFedrin and others, I am a ready signatory to that process. It'll take us into next week. We'll have a debate. I doubt it will come to that. Speaking personally, my bet is that the NDP members of parliament will be back at home right now, visiting with their family and friends and communities. Will come back here on Monday and initiate the process themselves. And the government and the police will suddenly figure out that they have found the way to do it without the Emergencies Act, and it'll be revoked. We'll put that on the record as a bet. But if not, I will willingly participate in the next step. Thank you.
Senator Simons. Senator Simons.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Senator Tanis, would you take another question?
Senator Simons.
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much, Senator Tanis. Like you, I find myself envious of the certainty of some of our colleagues. And like you, I am deeply troubled about the precedent set by the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And like you, I am still making up my mind. But I do have a question I wanted to ask about your assertion that you saw no white supremacists involved in the occupation in Ottawa, and your comment yesterday that nobody had been hurt as a result of this. The Coutts border arrests, which happened, south of where you live, but in your larger backyard, certainly give me pause. The police seizure of that many firearms, that much ammunition, the markings of the Diagolon white supremacist group with those weapons. And I'm wondering whether we aren't being a bit naive when we say, well, nobody got hurt, and it was just there were just a few wackos who attached themselves to this. When it seems to me that at the base of this protest was a very dark, very ugly, and very worrisome trend in this country that we need to be paying much more attention to.
Tanis.
Well, first of all, I think I said that nobody wound up in the hospital. I think we all saw a lady that got hit by a horse and got back up. Got back up and was interviewed, and that's. Can you imagine? And by the way, my comment was not necessarily about the virtue of those that were at the barricades. It was more around the discipline of the police and the tactics that they deployed in order to safely bring the Ottawa protest to an end. To your question about and you could be right. I mean, I don't know the people from Alberta that have been pointed at as the ringleaders in all of this. I don't know what their motives were in starting it, but I can tell you that the millions of people that expressed sympathy and support in one way or one form or another saw something in that gave voice to their frustration or part of their frustration. So I don't know whether, in truth, whether the protest was co-opted by ordinary Canadians with very real frustrations, or whether the convoy of real Canadians with real frustrations was somewhat co-opted by a very small group of people. I looked when I walked up and down there. I could not see flags. I sure saw a lot of flags. In first place was the Canadian flag by a mile. In second place was a flag that had a comment about our Prime Minister and a maple leaf on it. And I really, anything else could not have been said to be prominent. The placards up and down that were attached to the fence overwhelmingly were about personal freedoms and vaccination. I guess I don't know how. I can't comment. It's not in my area of expertise as to whether or not white supremacists are on the rise or on the wane or the same as they've always been. I think, you know, in a free society, we're always going to have those kind of people, and they're always going to be around, and we always need to stand up to them in whatever form is necessary.
Senator Dalphon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Senator Tanos take another question?
Because I'm going to do it in French. Alors, je voudrais vous remercier pour...
Thank you for your comments. I understood them well. A while ago, you said we had to look at the situation from the date of today, and that's also my understanding of the law. If from the 9 days ago and the date today, if we discover that some bank accounts were frozen and there were some interruptions in bank transactions following the introduction of the economic measures, it will be surprising for the Senate to confirm the declaration and later on start a process the week following to annul the regulation, asking for an end of the application of those measures. If I understood you well, what you're saying is that we should look at the situation as it stands today, including the impact that the declaration has had, some of which were positive, some of which were negative, before we take a stand. Did I understand you well, Senator Tanas?
I understand your point. However, there may be senators who are persuaded. I'm sure the government leader will be working furiously to make sure that people are persuaded that this must be confirmed, and then there is a process by which we can remove it, that we shouldn't conflate the two. And I believe there will be people who will be persuaded by that. So if you believe that and acknowledge that, and I think that is real, and it is every senator's right to make their decisions and on what basis they're going to make it. Having made that, whenever we vote, there may be a different decision that gets made 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 days from now, if we're still in this emergency measures, if it persists, that they could again turn their minds to it, free of the fact that they've confirmed the original thing. I've done it in my speech. I've confirmed the original, and I'm saying it's time to end it now. And I'm glad you said the law is on my side with this. I didn't know that, but I'm glad it is. Thank you.
Senator Moody.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've gotten an answer to the question that I had. Thank you very much.
Pate.
Thank you very much. Like Senator Simons, I too am still struggling, as you could probably tell from my comments yesterday. Many of us are extremely concerned that once this is done in this kind of circumstance, and I share I didn't mention it last night, but I share your incredible appreciation for the restraint that the state showed, that the police showed in this instance, at least in everything we could see and what was televised. Certainly I've heard from folks that there were other things happening that weren't televised, but everything we saw was incredible restraint, unlike what we've seen in many protesters involving Canadians of African descent, Indigenous folks throughout this country, land and water protectors, and so, as well as other protests. And so I'm extremely concerned, like you, that once done, how often can this be redone in the name of, particularly given whoever might be in power, who might choose to abuse such power, state power. I'm interested in whether you think the inquiry happening, which you talked about, is sufficient to ensure that we have the kind of accountability that you spoke about that we need to have in this country when we talk about using such incredible measures like the Emergencies Act, or whether you think we need to actually, and I take from what you've said that you would be part of and be able to participate in a group that would call for the immediate revocation of the act if it should pass this House, pass this chamber. What do you see as the way forward? I agree with you about the lack of leadership. What do you see as the way forward, and how do we bring this country together at this point, in your opinion? which I value.
Senator Tanis.
I think one of the things that has to happen is what Senator Husakos said. This is a moment when political points and your calculations about how to score it need to go out the window when we actually do the review of what happened. That those committee members need to be focused on what really happened and making sure that everybody who had a role to play and didn't play it, or who played a role they shouldn't have, is enumerated and it's brought to the light of day. And if that will go with not just the committee, but the selection of who goes into the committee. Leaders will have a responsibility. They will have a job of appointing people to that committee. Caucuses will have some role in that, in the House of Commons. And I speak specifically about the House of Commons. So if you're sending your political spin master into that committee to make sure that it all comes out to your advantage, we're sunk right from the beginning. So there is a moment before that committee starts where I think leadership has to begin. And I would hope that the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition and the caucuses and the NDP and the Bloc Québécois and all of us here would take that first step of leadership and put somebody in who has the expertise, the guts, and the willingness to work with others to make sure that a proper accounting of this takes place.
Senator Gold. Senator Gold, oh, sorry. Senator Page, you had another question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Tanis. Would you take a supplementary question? That's in the short term, absolutely. You mentioned, and a number of us have spoken about the longer term issues and the fact that this is decades in the making, the state and the situation we're in today. Would you agree that there's a need to really look at, and one of the next pieces of legislation we'll be looking at, we'll be trying to fix some of those who were left behind, the elderly during this period. Do you believe we also need to be looking at the fundamental fabric, the social, economic, and health frameworks that exist to support people in this country?
Senator Tanis.
Look, I think this is a very dangerous time. We have over the last 6 years spent an enormous amount of time, I have, listening and considering and advancing the rights of lots of minorities who have been waiting for their time to get recognized. If I was a leader of a minority, if I was in that position, I would be very worried. And the reason I would be worried is that the majority is at war with each other. They've split. In order, I believe, for minority rights to be properly recognized and protected, it falls to the majority to do it. And if the majority is dysfunctional, then God help the minority. We have work to do to heal the divide, this large divide, the 40-40 divide, 39-38 divide, whatever you want to call it, that exists in this country. I think before we can go anywhere, we're as gridlocked as Wellington Street was during the protest. That's got to get fixed. It's going to take some time, and it's going to take goodwill. And there will be lots of places along the way where I believe minorities will need to help the majority get back to to find common ground. They will need to call out bad behavior on all sides, not just the side that maybe they perceive is most helpful to them in the moment. We have to bring people together. You know, Senator Husakos once said something to me, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but he said, hey, I'm Greek, we argue. And I took that as, look, this is politics. This is a political institution, Parliament. We came here to disagree and to talk, but to find common ground and to always respect each other. We've got to start modeling that behavior if we are going to advance our country and every single citizen in it.
Senator Gold.
Thank you, Your Honor. Would you take a question, Senator Tanis?
Yes.
Thank you. At least you only have 45 minutes. Senator Tanis, thank you very much for your speech, delivered as always soberly and sensibly and with thought. As representative of the government, I appreciate very much your statement in the course of your speech that you confirmed that the government made the right decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. Nothing not done easily. You seem to assume, however, in your remarks that were the Senate to confirm that decision that the act would persist for 20 days. But in fact, as the government has been saying, and as I've said in this chamber as recently as yesterday, the government is reconsidering this hour by hour. It was cautious, indeed reluctant to invoke it. And but if the government made the right decision, prudent, cautious decision to invoke it, the question is this: do you doubt that the government, which is committed to be reviewing it on a regular basis, why would you doubt that the cabinet would not make the right decision when taking the advice of the law enforcement professionals that's informed this process all the way through, when they put their minds, as they do regularly, to whether it should end? So my question is really simple. Why do you think the government will be any less cautious, prudent, or responsible in the decision they have undertaken to review on an hourly basis?
Senator Tanis.
Well, first of all evidence to the contrary. The streets are clear. The emergency is over here in Ottawa. I accept that there was no way that conventional policing with the laws on the books could have done what needed to be done to encircle 100 square blocks and deny people entry and exit, to do what they needed to do in all of the other elements that are well enumerated, to break the back of that protest that had metastasized over 3 weeks. I accept that. There's lots of blame, and we'll get to the blame as to whose fault it was, doesn't matter. How could they have done it? And I believe that drastic decision had to be made. But today, to say that we need to continue an act that has been told to Canadians is the absolute last thing, that it must continue today, must continue in the next hour, hour after that, hour after that. When the purpose that it was invoked for, the clear purpose it was invoked for, which was here in Ottawa, that purpose has is no longer. That purpose has been dealt with. That is the issue. We have a fully functioning intelligence department. We have the RCMP. In this province, you've got the Ontario Provincial Police and you've got the municipal police. They didn't all go home. They've been working hard. They have laws and resources available to them. And there is nothing that I have heard that tells me that they still need that. We heard today, in fact, that we heard yesterday that there were all these bank accounts and, or what are they called? Banking products, financial products that had been frozen. And now we hear that they're starting to be unfrozen. Not that there's new ones, no new ones, just that the ones that were frozen. So it leads me to believe that the measures, the extra measures that are so repugnant to Canadians because they were told that this law was to be used once in a generation, maybe, that the powers in that law need to continue. It doesn't square. And I have not heard anything that convinces me otherwise. We heard from you about, and others, about the financial side of things. We heard about a bunch of truckers that are circling Ottawa or parked in a field somewhere waiting to come back as soon as the Emergency Act is revoked. Presumably this time the police have a plan if that happens. Or I guess if they don't, then we'll have to invoke it again. But it doesn't need to continue today. It should be put back in the closet where it belongs. Thank you.
Osakis.
Or, of course, the government can just lift the remaining mandates like everyone else is, and they'll never come back, at least for this issue. And you're absolutely right, Senator Tanis. You and I, we engage in debate here for many years, and sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree, but we respect our opinion. And you're right. I am a Greek, and of course, the word democracy, of course, demos is people, and kratia means rule of the people. That's what democracy is all about, and we should never forget that. I appreciate your interventions and your comments, and I agree with you and Senator Pate that by and large, this was a huge protest, but very tempered, very peaceful, and we have to give kudos to the police forces and the public security forces and the protesters because they found a way to protest, but yet when the police had to do what they had to do, they backed up and they retrenched and they backed up and they accepted the final finale while getting their point across. Where we've had, as Senator Pate has said, other protests in the city, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous protests, very legitimate protests, where in my own city, there were commercial violence, there were statues being desecrated. So my concern, will this precedent, if we don't put an end to it or set parameters and send a message to this government and future governments that this should not be a precedent, that every time the people rise up in frustration and there is some measured violence or there's some stretching of law and order, as we know in this country, because they want to express their democratic frustration, that other governments won't use this as a precedent in order to do something as draconian on environmental groups, indigenous groups, and others who will have legitimate reason to protest. And the final question is, we're a great federation. As you brought up, public security is a responsibility of municipalities, provinces, and governments in collaboration. Did we get any indication that provinces, municipal authorities were calling on the government to do this? It seems like there's at least 7 out of 10 provincial governments that have been outraged by this measure. Can you comment on both the precedent that this sets in terms of future protests, and why would the government do something when there hasn't been a call by other levels of government to ask for this across the country?
Excuse me, Senator Tanis. I'm sure you want to answer this question, but your time has expired, and there are a couple of other senators who want to ask. Are you asking for 5 more minutes? Or?
No.
No. Time is, thank you. Senator Toulajan.
Thank you, Speaker. Honorable Senators, I rise today to speak on the Emergencies Act. Its invocation is a testament to our government's failure to control protests happening on its doorsteps. Canadians are asking for leadership to guide them through the 3rd year of a pandemic and countrywide protests, but were abandoned for 3 weeks only to learn that our government has invoked an act against its own citizens. My office has, like most of the senators' offices, been receiving numerous emails and phone calls about the convoy. There had been growing concerns about the so-called freedom protesters who are fighting for and consequently taking away freedom from fellow Canadians. News of protesters taking over the nation's capital has gone viral worldwide, damaging Canada's reputation.
family and friends from around the world have reached out trying to understand what is happening in our country. As an advocate for human rights, I will always support the right to protest peacefully. At some point, this peaceful demonstration took a turn for the worse, and we started witnessing swastikas, Confederate flags, and even the Islamophobic 3%ers flag, a designated terrorist group by the Government of Canada. I heard stories of racialized parliamentary staff requiring escorts to enter their workplace. I also heard of women who stopped wearing a mask when leaving their home out of fear. While protesters have insisted their rights are under threat, I cannot help but wonder who is protecting the rights of the ordinary citizens of Ottawa. But what particularly worries me is this precedent this invocation sets. The Emergency Act allows the federal government to bypass ordinary democratic process. And according to the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the government has not met the threshold necessary to invoke this act. The executive director fears that normalizing emergency legislation threatens our democracy and our civil liberties. And on Thursday, February the 17th, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association announced they would legally challenge the use of the Emergencies Act. These emergency measures, I would like to specify, affect every single Canadian. Unlike the Prime Minister's assurances, these measures are not focused on certain areas. They're applied to the entire country. Already the Act will be used to broaden the scope of financing laws and allow government agencies and banks to share relevant information with the police, and this is only the beginning. I also worry about a lack of respect and adherence to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Of course, the Special Parliamentary Review Committee will be established to review the government's action under the Act. The committee's insights might come too late, as it appears to be a retroactive evaluation. Every measure under the Act must be scrutinized, weighed, and discussed to ensure the respect of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. More importantly, I fear the sweeping powers of the Emergencies Act may turn against racialized Canadians, such as the Canadian Muslim community of which I am part. Since 2001, my community has been excessively targeted by Canadian authorities and fellow citizens alike. Recent Islamophobic attacks have only shown that we are not safe. And according to the National Council of Canadian Muslims, who in reaction to this act said that we must preserve our right to protest while working with civil society to better understand what these emergency powers mean for the future of protest and to reinforce our charter rights. Mustafa Farooq, the CEO of the National Council of Canadian Muslims, or NCCM, shared a press release in response to the Emergencies Act. And he said, here I quote, "His Canadian Muslims are all too familiar with having community organizations, funds, initiatives be perceived with the suspicion by the security establishment. Many of us have questions that must be answered through a process that is transparent and not driven by partisan interests." End of quote. Of course, handling a protest in the nation's capital is no small feat. But the current chosen route is not one of unity. Multiple provinces have voiced their concerns and have clearly stated they're against these drastic measures. The Emergencies Act gives the federal cabinet unprecedented power to assume jurisdiction from the provinces and municipalities, which goes against the basic principles of responsible government under the Westminster tradition. Canadian provinces have worked hard since Confederation to enhance the status and peculiarities of their provincial governments. They now face an oligarchy and the disappearance of hard-earned powers. The Prime Minister had a choice to extinguish the flames of dissent weeks ago and defuse the situation. The government's lack of response to the protests and reliance on the Emergencies Act have put us at risk of severe, lasting repercussions on Canadian society for years to come. Only time will tell if our democracy will be better because of it. In the meantime, the protests are over, the roads are clear. So tell me, why do we still need the Emergencies Act? And like Senator Tanis, I was also very disturbed by the lack of leadership. Canadians were left on their own wondering where the government was. Canadians were looking to the Prime Minister for reassurance that everything would be well. But the Prime Minister was missing. He wasn't there when Canadians needed him most. But what he did was he invoked the Emergencies Act. And honorable senators, for these reasons, I will not be supporting the Emergency Act, and I will be voting no. Thank you.
Senator Pate?
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Toulajan. When Senator Hosaka spoke, he actually slightly misrepresented, I think, what I had said. I had talked about the concerns with protests like the Indigenous protests and Black Lives Matter, the concerns about the use of force, of state force against them. You also mentioned the concern you have about when, whether it's people of Muslim faith or other, those of African descent or Indigenous people speak out. I just want to confirm that that's one of the concerns, not that, in fact, it is those protesters who would cause harm, but in fact, it's state harm that often comes to them when we invoke these kinds of emergency acts.
Senator Toulajan.
Senator, what I am saying and what I'm reacting to is what I've been hearing from the community who are really, really concerned that this Emergency Act will do nothing to protect some of the minorities. And I guess, Senator Osakos, I don't think you misrepresented. I mean, I thought he was talking about, protection of everyone. But I agree with you. We have to be really, really vigilant. And the other issue is that here I talk about my community, as that a lot of them have come from countries where they didn't necessarily have the freedom to speak. They didn't know their rights. And I know of cases where things have happened and there's been excessive force used, and the community didn't know what recourse they had. I am here representing Canadians, but a certain community who look to me for answers, and they've been calling me, and they've expressed their concern. What does this do for this act do for our protection? And like the National Council of Muslims said, but we also need to have the right to protest peacefully. And I want to acknowledge that this was a peaceful demonstration. Somehow along the way it turned. And I also want to acknowledge that the police did show great restraint. I mean, we were all glued to our TV sets, just wondering what was happening in Ottawa.
Senator Pate?
Just supplementary. So you would share the concern that many of us that regardless of which party formed the government, there would be concern about not using this against individuals in a way that would actually reinforce stereotypes and discriminatory attitudes.
Yes, I would.
Thank you.
Senator Hosakos?
Yeah, I don't think I misrepresented at all. I think Senator Pate and I are on the same page, and I just want to clarify what you're saying, Senator Toulajan, is what I believe I hear from you, is that any group of protesters in this country, environmentalists, Indigenous groups, Black Lives Matter, people that are anti-mandates, that they will have that fundamental right to do it without the threat of this draconian hammer being dropped in the future. And what I'm trying to get across is this dangerous precedent, something that future governments that have a problem with the agenda of certain minority groups or have a problem with groups that just don't fit their political agenda, would this set a precedent that is very dangerous vis-a-vis all groups.
Senator Toulajan.
Senator, I would agree with you. It does such a dangerous precedence. I mean, I'm all for demonstration. Like I said, we need to have peaceful protest. We need to have give the Canadians the ability to let us know how they feel. Like Senator Batters mentioned yesterday, the Ukrainian community is very, very concerned. And I know that in Toronto, they were out there, expressing their concern. They were out there protesting. But yet in, the federal capital, the seat of the government, they cannot come. So I hear you, but it's always, as a human rights person, I support peaceful protest. Not anyone feeling threatened, not anyone feeling that they don't have the ability to perform their duties or go to work. Like we did see, I mean, there were instances where, and I know some young girls in scarf had to be accompanied. It was one of our own MPs, brought that issue up. So we were seeing that. So I think it's better to look at the reality of what was happening. And we wish it didn't happen. We wish it had been handled better. But we have a prime minister who was missing. We didn't hear anything from the government. And I fended calls from irate Liberals supporters who said, where's our prime minister? So, peaceful protest, I'm all for it.
Resuming debate, en débat, Sénatrice Odette.
Senator Odette.